Welcome to Sounds of Resistance. The war in Ukraine brought all the nightmares of Russian President Vladimir Putin. This invasion attempt, launched by Putin on February 24, was adorned with his Soviet imagination. Most experts said that this Russian march that started in Ukraine would continue and that Eastern Europe was also under serious threat. Putin's wonderland also turned into a hell for him, while experts who thought that Kiev would fall in 3 days were wrong in their predictions. At the last point, Putin is now making his last moves to save his oppressed army in Ukraine. But whether they can contribute is a big question mark, because once the superiority was in the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces, the heroic Ukrainians who took the wind behind them seemed to continue to chase the Russian army. Another disadvantage of Putin's latest move was that it dragged Russia into a great chaos. It turned into a firestorm after Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization. Vladimir Putin has described his vision for Russia as a country of solidarity and reconciliation in a day where more than 1,000 people were arrested for opposing partial mobilization to aid the faltering war effort in Ukraine. Hours after the Russian president announced that 300,000 reservists would be called in to stop the losses of his forces in Ukraine, he summed up his pride in his country's history in Veliki Novgorod to celebrate the 1160th anniversary of the Russian statehood. But while Putin was explaining the so-called pride, the country had already turned into a fire in the background. The names that Putin mentioned in his speech attracted a lot of attention. The historical figures he controls are even the terrible: a 16th century Tsar who killed his own son, and World War II who helped defeat the Nazis, whose presence in Ukraine was used by Putin as an excuse for him. World War II General Georgy Zhukov. He also said that he was considering adding Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin to the preliminary list before getting past that, as not enough time had passed for comprehensive and objective assessments independent of the pressure of ongoing political developments. Yes, his belief that he could make even the Russian dictator Stalin, who killed thousands of people, look cute, came to the fore as the phenomenon that most clearly explains Putin's current mood. Summing up his country's journey of more than a millennium through former Holy Russia, Tsarist Moscow, and Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union, Putin said that each of us has a great responsibility towards Russia to protect and strengthen our vast country. In other words, he declared again that he was running after the Soviet dream, which turned into a nightmare. Putin said that no one can ban Soviet history and civilization and that these ideals cannot be destroyed. He argued that it was impossible to destroy, or even less so, to destroy the values that made Russian society one and made Russia great. But on the same day, at least 1,386 people were arrested in 38 cities across Russia during demonstrations against Putin invasion and partial mobilization. Dozens were held in Irkutsk and other Siberian cities and in Yekaterinburg. In the statements made, more than 500 people have been detained in St. Petersburg and more than 16,000 have been arrested since February 24, when the occupation began. The political movement Vesna, which helped organize the protests, posted videos and pictures on its social media channel demonstrating an intense police presence at the demonstrations where people chanted "No to war." But far from the protests, Putin described the glory of the war effort in Ukraine, which he said was necessary to combat threats to Russia's sovereignty. In other words, Putin challenged not only the West, whom he saw as an enemy, but also his own people. Being patriotic is the essence of the nature and character of the Russian people, said Putin. Our heroes, soldiers, officers and volunteers displays precisely these superior human qualities during special operations, he said. Putin added that they fought bravely shoulder to shoulder to save the people of Donbas and claimed that this war still had its just sides. But the question on the minds of those who rebelled against Putin was that when this invasion attempt began, Putin's target was Kiev. Now he states that he only wants to save the Donbas. The main purpose of Putin, who downplays his goal, is perceived as basing his defeat on reasonable results. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, on the other hand, announced to world leaders that he had 5 conditions for reconciliation with Russia in response to Putin's statements. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky outlined to world leaders his 5 non-negotiable conditions for achieving peace with Russia after nearly 7 months of war in which thousands died. Speaking in a pre-recorded video message to the United Nations General Assembly, Zelensky called for Russia to be punished for launching an invasion against its neighbor Ukraine on February 24. "A crime has been committed against Ukraine and we demand its punishment," Zelensky said in a speech that gave the UN delegates a standing ovation. Zelensky said, "Ukraine wants peace, Europe wants peace, the world wants peace, and we saw just who it was that wanted war. Right now, all of the UN member states, there's only one entity who would say if he could interrupt my speech. That person is also happy with the war," he said. As part of his 5 stipulations, Zelensky said that Russia should be punished for waging war in Ukraine through an additional sanctions and by stripping Moscow of its powerful role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Russia's status means that it has the power to veto any decision whatever the opinion of the majority within the council. Zelensky also said that the lives of Ukrainians must be protected and that the country's internationally recognized borders must be respected. Its 4th and 5th terms included a call for new security guarantees for Ukraine and the world to unite to declare Russia's armed aggression. Zelensky warned that Russia may plan to use its military forces this winter to prepare for a new attack on Ukraine. This is a warning that should be taken very seriously, because military experts have similar thoughts with Zelensky on this issue and it's thought that Putin is waiting for winter. Putin will try to hold out until the winter, waiting for the Ukrainian armed forces to run out of weapons and ammunition stocks and for the West to cut their aid. Then he will make his strongest attack. The president said the partial mobilization showed that Moscow was not serious about peace talks. He noted that previous negotiations with Ukraine and Russia to end the war had failed. As you may recall, the Russian delegation and the Ukrainian delegation had a meeting in Istanbul. In the negotiations made by Turkey and the United Nations, Russia did not approach peace very much. Zelensky also reiterated calls for more Western-made weapons to help his country fight Russia. This request should be seen as an absolute necessity of Ukraine. Even though the West is becoming more insensitive to war with each passing day, it should be known that Ukraine needs the greatest support these days. After the speech, the European Union's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell told reporters that the bloc would impose additional sanctions on Russia. The Russian foreign minister said in an interview that the United States is at risk of becoming a combatant in the Ukraine conflict. In other words, Russia does not fail to threaten not only Ukraine but also the USA and the whole West. Knowing that the strongest threat in their hand is nuclear weapons, Russia constantly comes to the table with this threat. However, in this regard, they must first extinguish the fire of rebellion that the Russian people have lit, because Putin's people no longer believe him. According to Oleg Nikolenko, spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Ukraine is calling the UN Security Council for an emergency meeting because of Russia's holding a referendum in the occupied territories. Ukraine has demanded an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council regarding Russia's fictitious referendums on occupied Ukrainian territory. Russia should be held accountable for further attempts to change Ukraine's internationally recognized borders in a violation of the UN Charter, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in a statement on Twitter. Russia holds a referendum in the occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions on September 23 to 27.